Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. My name is Oak Mountain, and I'm your host. Today I'm speaking with Deus Fortier. Deus is a deeply curious and passionate multidisciplinary practitioner whose blended and broad approach to transformational facilitation was birthed from a desire to honor the vast nuances and complexities of the human experience. He employs many complementary modalities in his work, including somatic therapeutics, esoteric mysticism, entheogens, embodied eroticism, ritual, and more. With over a decade of immersive study and professional practice, Deus guides and supports others through a creative and emergent facilitation style. His work can be understood as a living collaboration with the people he serves and the secret intelligence that animates all life. Our conversation today explores Eros, the lover archetype, and the means by which men might come to reconcile the polarity of wholeness and differentiation. I hope you enjoy. Excellent, brother. Very excited for this conversation. Thank you so much for being here. I want to open with the question I offer every guest at the head of the show. What is the last thing that made you smile?
Last thing that made me smile. Coming up with the question that I was going to ask you today.
Excellent. Oh, that's very exciting to hear. That's great. So our listeners would have heard a little bit about you from the intro, obviously, but the depth and breadth of your work is far more than I might have been able to put into maybe a minute and a half's worth of introduction. So I know we spoke in our pre-call chat a bit about how you came to this, but I would love for you to, if you would, illuminate for our audience how it is you came to be engaged with this type of men's work that you're currently offering.
Yeah, thanks, Oak. It's really good to be here. So it's a long story, but the short version is I went through some very challenging experiences while growing up that kind of isolated me from other people. And I became very good at following my own direction. I became very nomadic, very independent, but struggled a lot with depression and loneliness. And I had a very profound spiritual experience that completely flipped my priorities in life. I sold everything that I owned, left my career, left my relationship, and went to go pursue monasticism with Self-Realization Fellowship, which is Paramahansa Yogananda's organization. They practice Kriya Yoga. So I got initiated in that process and became obsessed with enlightenment. I needed to understand the nature of reality and the nature of self. And that led me through my 20s. I explored a lot of different methodologies, a lot of different approaches: quantum physics, body-centered psychotherapy, transformational art. Got certified in a few methodologies, one of which is called Accelerated Evolution from my teacher Satyen Raja, which is kind of like a modern mystery school. They blend psychotherapeutic principles with esoteric mysticism. And then I started performing spoken word poetry. And this wasn't to be a performer, so to speak, but this was so that I had a platform to share my thoughts and feelings and ideas, the things that mattered most to me, and to make a bridge of connection with other people, because I was really struggling to participate in the world again after failing to be a monk. And as I started sharing from stage, what I call transformational art, I started getting requests for coaching and workshops. And so in my late 20s, I compiled all of the most powerful tools and principles and practices that I'd come across in a decade of study and practice in my own men's program, which is called the Impeccable Man Masterclass. I was at this time already friends with my colleague Ian McKenzie, who you know, some of your listeners may know. Very beautiful, mythopoetic leader of this generation, I would say. And him and I were kind of walking parallel to each other, exploring sexuality and eroticism, which has been a core theme for me in my life, having gone through some sexual trauma when I was younger. And him and I started exploring non-ordinary ways of relating, concepts like polyamory or open relationships. What does that mean? diving into sexual trauma and initiation ritual practices and ceremony. And we started collaborating about a year and a half ago and putting on retreats and immersions and online programs for men to explore this concept of eros through a mythopoetic and psychotherapeutic lens in ritual containers. And that basically leads us to where I am right now. And one piece that I kind of skipped over was psychedelics and plant medicine. They've always been a part of my journey, but not the primary path. But when I got into a relationship with my partner, her name is Aga, this beautiful, wonderful woman, about 7.5 years ago, we started co-facilitating psychedelic journeys together. So my approach to this kind of work is a really unique synthesis of many different styles and frameworks and modalities. And that's my preference, actually, because I find a singular adherence to a particular frame or model to be far too limiting when we are coming up against the multifaceted, nuanced, complex experience of what it means to be a human. So I love having a lot of different potential avenues to approach and to explore this wild experience of existing.
Brilliant. So from what I'm hearing, there was a core thread of, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but a core thread of the relational aspect of life that has come through this. Particularly, you mentioned this loneliness at the beginning, and then as your work began with Ian McKenzie, exploring maybe what is non-traditional or newer ways, if we want to call them newer. Non-traditional is probably more accurate. And in this sense, I get a picture that alongside this relational aspect, as well as this synthesis or this broad, almost meta aspect of disciplinary blending, is almost this reaching towards or this striving towards a sense of wholeness. It's like, can I reach out into the world, into this pond, into this forest, into this mountain, into this heart, and glean the wisdom available such that when you were called into this position of leadership and this position of facilitation, it wasn't that I show up with one book and go, okay, well, I have a book and we're going to use the book. It's like we can reach into this broader aspect. And what I find particularly relevant, and maybe this is a good jumping off point, is that this relational element to your own journey, particularly in your own development, as well as how it is now being expressed in your service, is also found in the core archetype that you and Ian are exploring inside the men's work, which is the lover. And for those who don't know, the lover archetype is most known from a book by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. And it's a rediscovering of masculine power through these archetypes. So I wonder if you can speak to your experience of that relationality from your own perspective, your own experience, as well as how it maybe birthed itself into this exploration.
Yeah, thanks for that. A few pieces to that. The first is it took quite a long time for me to reconcile that the relational path is one that I was actively engaging with, because a lot of the Kriya Yoga practices, deep meditation, pranayama practices, they're very interiorized. And a lot of those practices are about withdrawing energy and attention from the senses and from pleasure and desires and bringing it up to the higher centers. And there's one song by Paramhansa Yogananda that's called Desire, My Great Enemy. So I was strictly adhering to that. And it was mostly through indigenous ceremonies and teachings, actually, that I started reconnecting to the relational aspect of life. And this ties into one thing you were saying right before we started the recording of these kinds of conversations being emergent dialogue. I love that phrase because Ian and I use that as well in our facilitation. We call our facilitation style emergent. And so this really speaks to the core of what the relational path means to me personally. There is this desire to recognize, to realize, to actualize a sense of oneness and connection with all things. But that's only possible if we also recognize and honor the differentiation. between us. That's what makes relationship possible. And so emergence as a principle is really fascinating in that you have two things that have unique individual qualities that come together in some sort of synergistic relationship. And that relationship gives birth to something that has qualities that neither of the individual components themselves have. So this is the closest thing to magic that science recognizes. But this is actually this is what evolution is. So it's simultaneously an exploration of oneness, of interconnectedness, and differentiation. And we're expanding in both of those directions simultaneously. So greater differentiation and greater connection through the synergistic relationship. And the paradox, the polarity of that fascinates me. So I don't think we can get lost in an obsession with oneness without recognizing that relationship requires differentiation. So that was a big lesson for me.
That differentiation piece is quite a potent and, I would say, relevant energy in what I perceive to be modern discourse around relationships, particularly between men and women. And there's a lot of talk about polarity work, about the divine masculine, the divine feminine. And for those who are slower to deny the distinction, I'll put it this way, there is a great value to be found, like you're describing, in emphasizing the differences. And I want to note that, just as you said, in the emphasis of differences, that emphasis is balanced by the recognition of interconnectedness, interbeing, this interdependent nature and the relational nature of life.
Mm-hmm.
And so given that we're talking about polarity, we are looking at this from the lens of men's work, from men's psychological maturation, from the exploration of meaning. I know for myself that a lot of the meaning that I have come to discover about myself as a man has come through relationships. I would say almost all of it, save moments of deep meditation in ashrams in the middle of India, But then I'm in relation with all that is, so fair enough. It's all relational. And so I'm curious if we can explore here. I know we can explore. I know we spoke to pieces of the different elements that come up inside these polarities, and we might be, if you're interested, and I think you may be, it might be available to us to skirt some edges here of maybe the grittier parts, the more shadow aspects, or the pieces that either collectively or individually are sitting just below the surface around this type of polarity, around this type of relationality, because not all relating is sunshine and rainbows, particularly as men and particularly in relationships. There was, for a number of years, talks a lot about toxic masculinity. And I put that in air quotes for the people just listening, because there's toxic behavior and it can be expressed by men and by women. And I don't believe masculinity is toxic. I don't believe femininity is toxic. I think that people can be toxic based on their behavior. Let's say behaviors rather than people are toxic. So let me sum this up and into a question to pass for you here. So in this emphasis on the reconciliation of interdependence, of individuality, what do you notice, or what have you seen inside of your facilitation containers with men to be the bigger blocks or the more common blocks to this reconciliation process?
It's a good question. This ties into the first question that you asked that I didn't fully answer about the lover. And one of the reasons why we are kind of zooming in on the lover archetype as a point of focus, not to not pay attention to the other aspects, but to explore the archetype that not very many groups of men are targeting. And there's a lot of attraction towards the king and the warrior and even the magician, but not so much the lover. And I became curious about why. And for me, the lover can express itself through more um, culturally perceived feminine qualities of feeling and emotion and compassion and concern for the other. It's much more nurturing. And one of the things I've learned about the lover as the relational component, and maybe just to preface this, archetypes are not the actual territory of lived experience. They're simply a map through which we can perceive distinction, right? And so this is why they're valuable. They give us a shared language, but we all relate to them on a personal level. So we're all occupying the same territory while also maintaining our own individual relationship with those forces, those energies as they exist inside of us and outside of us. So the lover archetype is the relational component of recognizing consequence on other and perceiving and experiencing other as an aspect of self. And so through that lens, the lover archetype is the one that allows the other archetypal forces to mature into their fullest, most harmonious expression, because in the absence of the lover, the other archetypes have no recognition of relational consequence, and they become self-serving. And so you have the shadow expressions of the king, of the tyrant, or the weakling that can show up. But the lover also has shadow expressions, or immature expressions, I should say, of the impotent lover or the addictive lover. So tying this into the question of the blocks or the barriers that most men are experiencing, I think more often than not, the vast majority of the time, it has to do with revealing their feelings, honestly expressing their feelings. And oftentimes why that's being contained is because they fear that if how they feel is revealed, they will be emasculated, or their value or worth as a man will be diminished because they're not supposed to be emotional. So this is the main challenge that most men are facing. And there's two kind of levels to this that I've experienced. The first is allowing themselves to feel. First of all, we've built so much armoring and numbing around these feelings for decades often. But then the second component is allowing those feelings to be expressed, to be revealed into the space. And this ties into not just archetypal work, because this is where you go into embodiment and expression, but this is also deeply connected to basically all forms of psychotherapeutic processing, which, especially with the body-centered approaches, which are more trauma-informed approaches, which have really only emerged over the last few decades, they recognize inherently that our feelings, our physical sensations are intelligent. They're not random. And they're even conscious, so to speak, in that you can deliberately engage with them. You can have conversations with them. You can relinquish control over to them. And they are seeking to accomplish something that is actually in service to the system, whether or not our mind understands it. So if we can get the direct experience of this internally, which is to open up to the feelings and to allow them to express themselves, that intelligence is revealed. Through that process, you have the direct experience of the relational aspect of life, that nothing exists in a vacuum. We are in a relationship with our body. We are in a relationship with our emotions. And through that, we build bridges of connection and relationship with other. In the absence of that, in the absence of honest feeling and honest expression, how can we possibly have honest relationships? They're built off of a facade, and this is the space that most men are living in, which is why they're depressed and lonely and don't feel satisfied, regardless of the accomplishments that they have in life. So tracing that down into the lover to open the heart again, to resensitize and to allow honest and vulnerable sharing, so real intimate connection is possible, is really at the heart of the work that we're doing.
Profound, brother. I noticed a really resonant word that arises for me in listening to you that I didn't hear you say, and that's the word authenticity. That there is a deep fear, and you said the fear of emasculation and the fear of a loss in some sense of worthiness or value as a man. And I want to put a pin in that because that's a really important piece to return to. But even more fundamental is this relationship to the present moment, relationship to life. I like to say that a smile is saying yes to life, and that in actuality, the only choice we really have to make in any given moment is a yes or no to what is happening. And the endemic, perpetuated ancestral habit of denying what is alive in the body, denying this deep well of wisdom for men, I think is, I said ancestral, but I don't know that it goes back that far. I have this sense in me that if you go back maybe a couple hundred years, there is a very clear lineage of wisdom that was lost that would have supported this deep recognition of meaning and power in connection to the present moment via the vehicle of the body. And when you noted that we cannot have meaningful relationships if we are not in an authentic connection with our own body and our own mind, I think that yes, and the capacity to say yes really does highlight a bridge for me to the other archetypes. Because when I think about this and I think about encountering fear or the fear of emasculation, to me that calls forward the warrior. Like, I'm afraid. Okay, what does the warrior do? The warrior remembers strength. The warrior remembers courage. The warrior remembers purpose. Why is it that I need to do the thing that's scary and might kill me? Well, because there's something greater, right? And recognizing that the exploration of this lover archetype, man, does it really diverge from what we talk about when we speak in common culture about lovers? Because it is this very selfish, from my perspective, thing. It's like, oh, I want someone to love me, to dote on me, to cook for me, to think I'm handsome, and to fuck me, to whatever, all of these things for me. But in actuality, and we can speak to any parts of this, the lover, from my perspective, really is another role of service. Not only is it this deep connection to self and this opportunity to become, or enter into rather, a space of communion with this deeper wisdom of the body, with this deeper wisdom of the universe, but in so doing, we come forward and say, this is the strength of my heart. This is the nature of my love, and allow this to be a medicine and the fortifying waters for this garden of my family, for this garden of my community. And it really does change the dynamic between what can I get from this and how can I give. So some pieces there.
I have a question for you, actually, because
Yeah,
I love the way that you're articulating all of this. And I resonate with the aspect of the lover being reciprocal in nature. There's a quality of reciprocity. As soon as there's a recognition of relationship, you're going into some sort of reciprocal exchange of giving and receiving, and both are necessary for a relationship to occur. So I'd be curious to hear how you would define intimacy. What does intimacy mean?
I guess it depends on the lens that we're looking through. Given that we're speaking about the lover, we're speaking about relationship, I would qualify intimacy as, that's a really good question. The first thing that comes to mind is the sharing of vulnerability and the courageous act of being known and the compassionate act of knowing. I think those three really are maybe like a triad that comes around, because genuine intimacy is not transactional. It is reciprocal, and it is both a risk in the sense that it requires vulnerability, and also a great gift, because when we are practicing in intimacy, it's not just that you're intimate with me or I'm intimate with you. It is a mutual act. There's no single actor in intimacy, right? It's almost as though we're acting as a new one in union. And thus that unified aspect that underlies intimacy is the indicator or the foundation of an innate reciprocity that you're speaking to. If that makes sense. It's like dancing. It's like, you know, if you're really dancing with someone, you're not dancing with someone. You two dance. And there is this, right? It's like, you know, you go to see a guy at a club and he's dancing at someone or on someone. It's like, yeah, okay. Not a great thing. That's not dancing.
Yeah, nobody wants that.
You're doing something. Nobody wants that. It's not great. But when you're really engaged in a dance or a flow or even in dialogue, like what we're doing right now, this is us working towards mutual understanding. It is a unified exchange. So that's how I would speak to intimacy.
Beautiful. I love that. Thank you. I was listening to one of my teachers, Rafael Manacorda. He has an excellent podcast called Shamanic Principles of Leadership yesterday. And he was speaking about power, but at one point he's speaking about love. And just kind of off the cuff, he says, love is the desire to understand something intimately. And it's the moving towards that, to understand something intimately. And what is intimacy? It's a really interesting question, because even as you're describing like dancing or this conversation and the reciprocal nature of the exchange, that there's the me, there's the you, but then there's something between us that is also alive, that neither of us is controlling, and yet we're participating in that. That's one of the mysterious qualities of emergence for me. And this is probably the thing that I'm most fascinated by, is that there is a living intelligence that is yearning to flow through relational encounters, and that we get to participate in that. And it actually unfolds with greater ease if we don't control it, but we still lean towards it. And to me, that's an expression of love. So if you just take that as a principle and you apply it in every direction, and you're applying that towards the feelings and the emotions that are uncomfortable or that you've avoided, or things like conflict in a partnership, if you can actually lean towards that and it leads to some kind of repair, that actually deepens your connection and your intimacy and your trust. So it's like this concept of intimacy and even love. It's not bound to a singular expression or quality of experience. It's all pervasive. It's permeating all things. You know, it's tied to our connection with the trees and the earth and the sky and the sun and each other, dialogue, physical sensations. It's interwoven with the very fabric of reality, and then it shifts and changes its expression based on the intelligent needs of the moment. And one of the reasons why this fascinates me so much is because I launched myself into an obsession with spirituality. I wanted to understand the universe and the nature of reality. And after this really long road, it led me inside of my body. I was trying to go everywhere else and found some amazing things, but eventually it brought me into my body, and I discovered everything that I was looking for on the macrocosmic scale inside. And having the lived experience of that intelligence moving through all of the relational encounters, all of the feelings, all of the expressions, it's like this huge weight off the shoulders to know that I am not what is holding up the quality of experience. All I have to do is listen and respond with a willingness. And that's speaking to your definition of intimacy. And in that definition, all of life is an intimate experience. And Sabina Lichtenfeld from Tamara would say, all of life is an erotic encounter. Because then we go into, okay, how does intimacy relate to eros or eroticism and sexuality? You know, that is why we kind of combine the exploration of the lover archetype, which is what we've been exploring, and eros. You know, what is this force that is drawing things into intimate connection? Why is it doing that? And how does it do that? Through all the layers of our being and our life.
There's a really potent piece in recognizing that this living intelligence that you mentioned as flowing through all encounters and having this sort of yearning to be met. There's this magnetism towards this living intelligence. I would speak to this in saying that that is an expression of the real or the true. And that when we are looking to develop relationships or intimacy, that is, at least in some aspects, a very powerful North Star. That if one is oriented in their own life towards that truth, particularly as a man, what is the truth of my being in this moment? What is the truth of this moment in my being? All other aspects of experience will almost snap into place, because there is actually, this is something that Dolphin Casper said to me. I interviewed him a few episodes ago. He said, how can I orient to the point of deepest wisdom in any interaction? Maybe that's in you, maybe that's in me, maybe that's somewhere in between us, but consistently finding our orientation to this place of deepest wisdom, I think, is no different than an orientation and a commitment to truth, connecting to it, discovering it, expressing truthfully and authentically. And as it relates to Eros, this is the really interesting piece, because there is a unified element to the articulation that we're exploring here, to say that, okay, I went to India and Nepal, and I went all the way around the world through Indonesia and all these different places, and talked to the gurus and got the beads and did the rituals and drank the ayahuasca. And eventually I ended up exactly where I was, paying attention inside, rather than all of these different techniques. And what this says to me in terms of universality is that it, hard air quotes, that juicy golden nectar that we seek as students, as learners, as adepts or monks or whatever, is here, and it's every here. So there is a non-distinction, a universality to that well. It is always here now. And bringing it back to Eros, now we have to explore that edge that you brought up earlier in the conversation around the balance between the interdependentness, or this wholeness, and differentiation. Because when I am connected to my own body, when I'm grounded and I am alone in meditation, say, that is a very different experience than if I am present with a female lover. Everything is different about that. That human in front of me is different. There's, they smell different. They look different. Everything is changed. My body is changed. The air between us is changed because of this very clear distinction. There's not to get too off track, but there's a comedian who said, the thing I love most about women is that they're not men. It's like, yeah, that. The distinction is really what creates this polarity, at least for the heteronormative space. And that piece is an edge I'd love to explore a bit more. How is it that we meet the blending of this innate universality while necessarily needing to recognize and honor a very real difference?
Wow, that's a big question. As you were speaking,
welcome to the smiling human.
Yeah, how to unpack that one. What shows up for me as you were talking is my relationship with my partner Aga. And it feels like we've been together for 7.5 years now, almost 8 years. And I think one of the most valuable insights, reminders, revelations that I'm continuously having in a relationship with her is that she lives in a completely different reality than I do. Like, she perceives things completely differently. She has different definitions for words. She has different feeling responses. She has a completely different background and history and compensations and qualities that she's developed than me. And there's so many issues that can arise if I assume that she is the same as me in any way. Now, that being said, the ways that we are similar or connected or resonate naturally emerge without me necessarily seeking them out. But if I assume that she is completely different and I'm curious about that, if I really want to understand how she perceives and experiences things, that completely changes my orientation towards her, which then creates the opportunity for real connection and intimacy. And through that, we are connected. And somehow by being in that resonant frequency with each other, which is like being in a bubble, it's like being in a field, that just being in that space together reveals how we are the same. But I think rather than trying to actively pursue the ways that we are the same, that creates a lot of distortion and friction and misunderstanding. So I think it's mostly for me about the internal orientation towards the other, of assuming that I do not understand. And if I operate from that assumption with genuine curiosity, it opens me up to receive new information. And that's the emergent quality, And through that, I am compelled into connection and contact, and I get the direct experience of oneness. I don't need to actively pursue it or seek it out or even think about it. I get the direct experience of it by actually approaching others as unique expressions of something that I don't fully comprehend. And somewhere in the middle there is, the mystery of what you're speaking to for me. I think one of the things that I'm seeing anyway in our current culture is almost like this militant and even violent assertion that individuality is everything. But what ends up happening is people start claiming an identity with a level of ferocity and like solidifying a certain state of being, and then trying to enforce that perception of them onto the external world. And not just the perception, but the adherence to that. And so in claiming the individual identity that they are with so much certainty and rigidity, and then trying to impose that upon the external world, that destroys the possibility for intimate contact, because there's no curiosity there. There's no openness there. There's no recognition or honoring of the uniqueness in the other as being equally as valuable, and giving them the freedom to be that without trying to change them or to change their perceptions. The audacity of that, of me trying to inform your perceptions on reality, is infringing upon your free will. And it's placing myself in a position of authority over you as being more valuable, and is diminishing your own worldview, your own identity, your own experience. And that fractures and fragments relationship and turns into conflict and misunderstanding. So it's like both of those sides, of like, yeah, all is one. And that can lead to, all sorts of spiritual bypassing and dissociation and, avoiding responsibilities and all sorts of things. As such, the other side of things of individuation, if either is held with that kind of like zealous, righteous, violent energy, it distorts the whole mechanism. And so I don't actually know how to balance those two properly, but just tying back to what I was saying at the beginning, for me, what has worked the best is to just recognize that others are different than I am, and I want to understand them more fully. And then, like what you were saying with intimacy, if they meet me with that same energy, then real relationship is possible. And how we do that, I think, is a never-ending, always unfolding process, because each person is unique. We're going to meet each other in different ways. But for me, one of the critical elements is curiosity. Genuine curiosity, I think, is like the golden key that opens any door. And it's rare. It's rare to find people who are genuinely curious about others. Normally, they have some sort of motivation.
Another brilliant and profound piece of insight, brother. With that, we'll take a short break and come back for the second half. Let our listeners digest some of that. As the first half of our show sets in, I wanted to thank you for listening to the Smiling Human podcast. This show would not be possible without the support of listeners like you. Liking and following on YouTube, sharing with a friend, or following on your local podcast app are all easy and simple ways that you can support this show and help it grow into the future. If you do want to support this show directly, you can consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Patreons get perks like early access to all episodes, behind-the-scenes content, and access to live Q&As with me. If this feels within your means, then please consider becoming a patron. Now let's get back to the show. Beautiful. Alrighty. Well, as I do, start the second half of these shows with a section that I call Question of the Week. This is where I invite our guests to bring forward a question that is meaningful to them, relevant to the topic at hand, or something that we might find interesting to discuss for the audience. So, Deus, brother, what have you got for us this week?
I'm curious how relevant this question is now, because I built it off of our original conversation before we hopped onto this interview like a week ago. But I guess this is kind of the direction that we were moving towards by starting to tap into this aspect of eros and intimacy. A big part of my curiosity in that territory has to do with the cultural normative approach to sexuality and how that ties into everything that we're speaking to so far of intimacy and connection and relationship. So the question that I had, really curious to hear your thoughts on this. In our current cultural climate, what would be required of someone to transition from immature sexuality to mature sexuality? What would that mean?
Inside of the current cultural climate, what would it mean for someone to transition from immature sexuality to mature sexuality? The first thing I would say is that we have to clarify what we mean by someone, because the passage from immature to mature sexuality is different for men and women. The rites of passage are different. The bodily activation is different in the sense that, and I talked about this actually with Michael Bates, that the transition into womanhood is brought to the woman through their menses. It's like, now you're beginning your womanhood, whereas in us as men, we do not have this, and our rites of initiation and maturation need to come through a society of brothers and a society of men. So I would, given that I have more experience living as a man and zero experience living as a woman, I would answer it from that lens to say, what would it take for a man to move from immature sexuality to mature sexuality in this current climate? Mm-hmm. The first thing that comes to my mind is other healthy male relationships. That's the very first thing, because in order to mature, we have to, in some sense, be in an environment that cultivates the qualities of the mature masculine. And this is done through transmission. It's done through modeling. It's done through mentorship. It's done through ritual. And so that's the very first thing that is required, is a community around a man, or a boy, I guess, if we're saying from immature to mature, because there's still boy aspects of the psychology, to be brought across the threshold from boy to manhood. That community is necessary.
Can I ask you
inside
something
of this
within that before
Sure.
you carry on? How would you define mature masculinity?
Yeah. How long you got? So, great question. How I define it, and this is not the definition, and I already recognize that there's a lack to this because it's something that I explore on the daily. The claiming of one's nature as all of these different archetypes, but as man, right? This is our power, it's our intelligence, it's our responsibilities, it's our rights, it's our pleasure, it's our creativity, it's our emotions, it's our strength, it's our weaknesses, it's our foibles in the face of temptation, claiming all of that, reaching forward and saying, this pot of gold and lead I will pull unto me. This is my own. And that's one aspect of it. The second piece is when that has been claimed as one's responsibility to treat with, to, I don't want to say deal with because it's not a problem, but to bear up the weight of turning and sifting the gold from the lead and then taking the lead and turning it into gold. There's a balance and a wisdom that comes forward for how it is that our innate masculine qualities express themselves in the moment. And that speaks to this capacity to attune to the authenticity of the body, the authentic needs of the moment, and to approach others and the present with a depth and curiosity that allows that wisdom to come forward. It's like the idea that Jordan Peterson put forward like 3 episodes back when he was on Joe Rogan. He was talking about the definition of meekness and how meekness is often conflated with the idea of being harmless. And that his argument is being harmless is not actually morally virtuous, because if you can't do harm, then not doing harm is not a moral good because you couldn't have done harm in the first place. You couldn't have done the bad. And so that meekness is not harmlessness. Rather, meekness could be understood as those who have swords know how to use them and keep them sheathed. So there's a necessity to understand what it means to be a warrior. I know I can be violent. I know I can do harm. What it means to be a magician. I know that I have intelligence. I have an intellect and a capacity, and I know that I can manipulate. I know that I can influence this world. What it means to be a king. I know that I have influence. I know that I have responsibilities, and I know that I can loom my power over people in an inappropriate way. And with a lover, I know that I can be sensitive, attuned, and generous, but I also know that I can be addicted, or I can be complacent or self-absorbed or what have you in all of these aspects. The mark of the mature masculine is, from my perspective, having traversed the territory of all of these different aspects of self, all of these different aspects of masculinity, and touched them all, known them intimately, such that that intimacy allows for the genuine wisdom to be in the driver's seat. I'm not going to be taken over by the shadow. I'm not going to be taken over by temptation. I know temptation. Hello, temptation. Yeah, come in, sit in the back. Whatever, man. I know the proclivity for rage or for violence or the desire to protect. And the maturation process is not just knowing all of these pieces, but feeding those that bring forth the greatest good into the world, into the relationships, into the community, back to the earth, right? It's really stepping into what it means to be a man, what it means to be human.
And so this process of initiation from boyhood into manhood is becoming intimately familiar with all of the different archetypal forces of masculinity, just using that model, having access to the full range of territories so that you have agency in how you actually meet life rather than being driven by unconscious impulses or motivations. And so how does that tie into the maturation of sexuality?
At present, our culture is informing male sexuality in a number of deeply poisonous and deleterious ways. And so, given that the question was in our current cultural climate, I would say extricating, or this is interesting because the journey of the boy to manhood is not solely done by the boy. This is what I mean. Like and to answer this question, I have to speak to other men about helping boys transition into men, because that's where the wisdom comes from. And so this protection of innocence is really key. It's something like more than half of boys by the age of 11 have seen some form of pornography or even hardcore pornography at 11. I was playing Pokemon at 11.
Red or blue?
Like, this is insane. Red.
I was a blue guy.
That was my first. Yeah, right. No, it's great. I got them all. Don't get me wrong. But and so the protection of innocence is key. Recognizing that the transition cannot be one that the society pulls out with poisoned claws and saying, look at all of this distorted, darkened, and false nature of what it means to have sex, what it means to be a sexual being. And so first off, protecting that is key. Extricating the boy from any sort of influence in that sense is very, very key. And then exposing through ritual, through the relationships of brothers, uncles, parents, who hopefully are in some sense on this path of maturation, exposing them to ideas, conversations, practices, books, rituals that open the door to an exploration that is guided at the pace of the boy, of their own sexual development. It's like so many of these boys are being hypersexualized at such a young age, either through exposure to pornography or traumatic experiences and what have you. And the fullness of the mature masculine sexual essence is being nipped at the bud, really, because there is no pathway for the boy to become a man at the pace that nature would intend. And so I think recognizing that that is the natural, not natural, that is the current and real state of our cultural environment, that we as brothers, as fathers, as uncles can look at the trajectory that these young boys are going on and say, okay, how can I protect? How can I generate a space for this boy to be a boy as long as he needs to be a boy? Because his own spirit will make it known as to when the time is right to transition. Obviously, the onset of puberty is a piece of this, but it's clear. Like it's clear for me, anyways. Like when I look at a boy who's at this sort of transitional stage, it's like, okay, you're not ready, and then you meet a boy who's maybe a couple years older, and you're like, yeah, it's your time. Like you're ready to take on this responsibility, to be shown and to start to develop these pieces. Because if you don't, by the time you get to 20, 30, 40, 60, and you haven't, then that boy psychology remains, and a voice and heart and spirit that could have informed and nourished a society has been mute for decades.
Interesting. You're talking about this transition, this kind of like organic transition point that unfolds. And I've been fascinated by how much of my eroticism was actually formed prior to puberty. And there's an amazing book called The Erotic Mind by Jack Morin, where he explores this. And just to simplify one of the things that he was saying, he's speaking about how our erotic mind is formed in conjunction with our personality, in the same way as our other patterns that I was talking about before. Well, some of it actually pre-verbal as well, like our relationship to pleasure and connection and physical sensation. And I'm just curious about, like, from this lens or this framework that you've presented, if there's room to acknowledge or explore sexual energy from the place of boyhood. And if so, what the role or function of that would be.
It's an interesting question. It depends on what we would define as sexual energy. Because from one lens, we could say that our own vitality, our chi or our prana, our essence is sexual energy, that we are in fact just full of life force all the time, and that the very energy that has our heart beating or our liver cleansing and our kidneys purifying, that's all sexual energy by that definition, right? And so an exploration of that is movement, it's dance, it's the martial arts, it's exercise, it's play, right? There's all of these different pieces. But if we're to say that sexual energy is maybe more specific and more confined to, and maybe this is a false distinction, I'm not entirely sure, but if we were to say that it is confined to the sexual organs or the exploration of what that means in terms of pleasure or interacting with another, in terms of that space of the body and that type of energy, that's an entirely different discussion. So maybe before I answer your question, you tell me which of those two, or maybe a third that feels more true.
Yeah, I appreciate your desire to create some distinctions. So as I've dove deeper into this territory, I am suspicious of the phrase sexual energy. It's one of the reasons why I've started using the term eros and erotic energy, because for me, sex actually feels more like an act. But sexual energy itself is erotic energy that has many different forms of expression. And sex is just one narrow band of how that energy can be expressed. It's a very narrow pathway, although it's a very heightened experience of how that energy can be experienced and expressed. But it's not limited to that singular channel. And this is a big part of the work that Ian and I do, is actually broadening our understanding of what that energy is, how it feels, and how it seeks to express itself through relationship. Again, both internally and externally. Like, you can have an erotic encounter just inside of your own body without stimulating any of your sex organs. You can tap into the sense of pleasure and euphoria through any type of creative act: singing, drawing, painting, dancing, crafting a program like I'm doing right now. Different types of relational encounters. Like, if I feel an erotic charge and that's attracting me towards a person, if I'm automatically interpreting that as a sexual impulse, that can create a lot of problems, versus just recognizing that there's an attraction, there's a charge that's drawing us into contact and connection, becoming curious about how that energy might want to move or be explored or expressed in creative and consensual ways. Then we have a much larger territory to explore. And then if we do start moving into what you could call sexual territory of stimulating sex organs or whatever, that requires a very clear conversation of what that means, like what that entails, what is considered to be sexual in that kind of encounter. Does that include kissing? Is that direct contact with the genitals? Like, what are the lines that we're drawing, when we talk about a sexual encounter? So when I'm speaking about sexual energy, really I'm speaking about erotic energy, but that shows up through sexual experiences. And so the question is specifically about sexual exploration as a child versus just the pure experience of erotic energy that might unfold. So including like, exploring genital stimulation or like sexual pleasure as a child, like what the potential value there might be. And this is a question that I've held for a very long time, and I don't know the answer to this, is what kind of education would support a boy who's developing to build like a healthy relationship to sexual energy within himself prior to maturing to a level where he can respectfully and consensually engage with other people. Like, what is the role of sexual exploration, and how could we support boys in developing a healthy relationship to sexual experience prior to that transition point of, boy to man?
I think the answer to your question might be found in some of the pieces of wisdom you've offered in this conversation already, which is, I would address that with a responsiveness to the moment, because it's not every boy is going to be exploring their bodies before puberty. Some will, some won't, right? Maybe most will, but as a parent or caregiver or guardian who's looking to foster this healthy development of a healthy relationship, the development of a healthy relationship inside the boy to his own sexual energy, it has to be informed by what is present. I don't think that it is a good idea to introduce anything that is not being called for or not relevant based on what the boy is going through. Like, I can imagine a scenario. No, okay, let's put ourselves on one side of the spectrum and say, you've got the complete repressive abstinence only, boners are a sin kind of vibe, which is heinous and repressive. And we needn't, encourage that kind of perspective. Go to the other side and you're talking to kindergartners about different sex acts and how they can explore their body. And it's like, nope, that is edging on pedophilia and sexual abuse, in my opinion. And so I think it would be wisest if we are guided by the wisdom of nature, and the wisdom of nature will express itself through the child's body. And that is to say that if the child is exploring or, is maybe obsessed with their genitals at 5 or 6 years old, it's like, okay, that's okay. You can explore your body. Here's where we explore our body. We do it in the bathroom or we do it in the bedroom. We don't do it when people are over, and you wash your hands afterwards. Great. Simple. Allow the wisdom of the child to go, okay, this is what feels normal. This is regulatory, or this is a part of my own psychological, psychosexual development. Obviously, we're not saying this, but we can recognize that that's what's taking place developmentally. Great. And so there's a real dance of not introducing shame or repression to that which is naturally arising in the moment, which is what we're saying. Honoring what is present in the moment without introducing, imposing, or rejecting what's happening naturally. I think that's maybe the safest way to go, personally.
I love that. I'm responding to what's alive in the present moment. This is tying in beautifully to everything that we've spoken of before. Can I present something, like my perspective on this?
Absolutely.
A lot of men who come to the immersions that Ian and I facilitate, which is called Awakening the Wild Erotic, a lot of the men have this desire to go through some initiatory process to step into a healthier, more mature expression of their sexuality. And the introduction of erotic energy, or eros, as something that is much broader and wider and deeper than just sex, is actually a foreign concept to a lot of men. Not all men. It's not foreign to men who have been more exposed to archetypal work, but still, it's a unique concept in our culture. And what I've discovered through the exploration of erotic energy as it plays out in sexual encounters seems to call for the cultivation of certain skills, actual skills that can be learned. And this is especially prominent in conscious kink, where we're deliberately exploring sensations and role dynamics and energies and scenarios. And for me, I think it comes down to two primary skills that most of us have not cultivated or been exposed to or have had modeled to us, like what you were talking about before. And this ties into the lover archetype. The first is a hyper awareness of what is happening inside of us in our present moment experience across as many dimensions as we can track. So somatic, so physical sensations, emotions, thoughts, and images. Those are what my teacher Satyan calls the 4 components of consciousness, but predominantly what's happening in the body, your physical sensations. So being aware of that, first of all, and second, being able to interpret those signals, right? So this is resensitizing to the internal landscape in present moment experience. And then the second skill is learning how to communicate that honestly in real time. So if we have both of those skills and we're in an encounter with somebody who also has both of those skills, then we can clearly communicate desires and boundaries, which creates the conditions for a consensual encounter. It clarifies a lot of things. In the absence of that information, we don't know what's happening inside. And if we aren't able to communicate, then we're not going to be engaging in a consensual encounter, and we're not even going to be pursuing authentic desires, and we're not going to have an awareness of our authentic boundaries, which is where most people are at. Most people are actually just defaulting into a patterned way of approaching and experiencing each other on a sexual level. And there's a lot of fear and inhibitions around actually exposing what's really going on inside of them, which creates a lot of problems. So for me, at least working with men, because I don't work with children, is cultivating those two qualities: hyper awareness of what's going on in the body and the ability to communicate that in real time. In the absence of that, I don't know how we can even have consensual encounters.
And so for men out there who recognize the value of what you're saying, the necessity of this awareness of the inner landscape and the skill of bringing that to language and offering it forth into the other, where can they find you, your work? How can they get in touch with this aspect that you're offering?
Yeah, thanks for that. There's a few different ways. The collaborations that I have going on with Ian McKenzie can be found at themythicmasculine.com. We have a few different offerings on there. If people are interested in reaching out to me directly, I do one-on-one work, both in person and online. I have a men's program, which is an 8-week online guided coaching program, as well as one-on-one coaching. I also do breathwork and medicine ceremonies, and those can all be found at thesomaheart.com. Or you can also find me on social media as Deus Fortier, both Facebook and Instagram.
Beautiful. Well, brother, this has been a profoundly enriching and enlightening conversation. I want to thank you again for your time and all of your contributions and for the work that you're doing with men.
Thanks, Oak.
It's sorely needed.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here with you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing on YouTube or giving a follow on your local podcast app. I know I said it in the mid-roll, but I'll say it again. If you'd like to support this show directly, you can do so at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. You'll gain access to perks like early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes content, as well as access to live Q&As. Also, I've just produced an insight journal and I want to give it to you for free. You can find access to this month-long personal development journal in the link below. This is in the show notes or in the YouTube description. Also, if you feel inspired by the sharing that has taken place in conversations like this and you want to work with me directly, you can find a link to a free call below. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you again.